They had already decided she was guilty before the sun cleared the rooftops, and in a town like this, that was usually enough to make it true. The rope hung still in the morning air, swaying just slightly as if it already knew its purpose, and beneath it stood a woman no one would meet in the eye, her hands bound, her shoulders steady, her silence louder than the crowd that circled her, whispering, judging, agreeing without thinking. Because agreement was easier than doubt out here where dust settled faster than truth. Her name was Nayeli, though no one bothered to ask it. Not the shopkeeper who had pointed her out, not the men leaning against the hitching posts pretending this was justice. Not even Sheriff Briggs, who stood a few feet away with his hat pulled low, his fingers resting on his belt like that alone gave him authority, because in his mind, and in theirs, she was not a woman first, not a person with a past or a reason. She was Apache, and that single word had already filled in every blank they were too tired or too afraid to question. The wind moved through the street carrying the dry smell of wood and leather, brushing past boots planted firm in the dirt, past faces set in certainty, past a platform built too quickly and believed too easily. And through it all Nayeli stood without struggle, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the edges of the town, as if she had already stepped outside of it in her mind, as if whatever they thought they were about to take from her had already been taken long before this morning. Someone in the crowd muttered something about stolen cattle, another about a man who hadn't come home, stories stacking on top of each other without shape or proof, just enough to feel right, just enough to keep the rope from looking like what it was, and Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat as though he might speak, as though he might turn this into something official, something that sounded like law instead of fear, but the words didn't come. They rarely did when they mattered most. Then came the sound that didn't belong, not loud, not urgent, just steady, the slow rhythm of hooves pressing into dry ground from the far edge of town, and it didn't stop the crowd at first, didn't turn heads right away, because men ride through towns every day out here, but something in the pace of it, something in the way it didn't hurry and didn't hesitate either, began to draw attention one glance at a time until the whispers thinned and the circle loosened just enough to let the rider come into view. Ethan Cole didn't look like trouble, and he didn't look like peace either, just a man worn by miles. Dust on his coat, eyes that had seen more than most cared to admit, and he didn't reach for his gun, didn't call out, didn't demand anything. He simply rode forward until the space in front of the platform belonged to him, and for a moment, nothing moved, not the rope, not the sheriff, not even the wind, because there is a kind of silence that only shows up when something is about to change, and no one can yet name how. Ethan's gaze passed over the crowd, not judging, not accusing, just noticing, and then it settled on Nayeli, not her bound hands, not the rope above her, but her face, the way she held herself like someone who had already been judged long before this place, long before this morning, and he studied that in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why, because it suggested there was more to see than they had bothered to look for. He swung down from his horse slow and deliberate, boots landing with a soft thud that sounded louder than it should have. And still he said nothing, not to the sheriff, not to the crowd, not even to her. He just stood there close enough to be part of it now, close enough that leaving would no longer be simple, and Sheriff Briggs shifted his weight, finally finding his voice though it came out thinner than he intended, telling Ethan this wasn't his concern, telling him to move along, telling him what every man tells another when he hopes not to be questioned. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just took one step closer, eyes drifting down for the briefest moment to something at Nayeli's wrist, something small, leather-worn smooth, marked by time and use, and when his gaze lifted again there was a change in it, slight but undeniable, like a man who is just recognized a detail no one else thought mattered. The crowd leaned in without meaning to, drawn by the quiet instead of noise, by the absence of force instead of its threat, and Ethan finally spoke, not loud enough to command but clear enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard. One simple question laid into the dust between them all, and in that instant, the certainty that had filled the town since dawn began to loosen its grip, just enough for doubt to take its first breath. The question did not echo, it settled, heavy and unwelcome, like dust on a table no one had touched in years, and for a long moment no one answered because answering meant thinking, and thinking meant risking being wrong. Sheriff Briggs shifted again, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the men nearest him, as if one of them might step forward and carry the weight for him. But they did not, their eyes sliding away, boots scraping lightly against the dirt, each man suddenly more interested in the ground than the woman beneath the rope. Ethan Cole did not move, did not press. He simply waited, and there was something in that stillness that stretched the silence thinner and thinner until it began to feel like something might tear. Finally, Briggs cleared his throat, forcing a dry laugh that did not reach anyone's ears, saying that they had witnesses, that the town knew what had happened, that not everything needed to be spoken aloud for it to be true. But even as he spoke, the words seemed to lose shape, as if they could not hold themselves together under the weight of being heard. Ethan's gaze did not leave him, calm, steady, not accusing, just present, and he asked again, softer this time, but somehow sharper, who saw it? Not what they believed, not what they heard, but who stood there and saw it with their own eyes. A man near the back shifted his hat lower, another coughed into his hand, and somewhere a loose shutter tapped against wood in a slow, uneven rhythm, filling the space where certainty used to live. Naeli's eyes moved then, just slightly, not toward the crowd, not toward the sheriff, but toward Ethan, as if measuring him, as if deciding whether his question was a blade or a bridge. And when their gazes met, there was no plea in hers, only a quiet kind of recognition, the kind that comes when someone finally notices what others have chosen to ignore. Ethan took one more step forward, close enough now to see the fine cracks in the leather wrapped around her wrist, the faint stains pressed deep into it, and he lifted his chin just a fraction, drawing the attention of the crowd without raising his voice, asking another question, where is the body? Because a man does not simply vanish without leaving something behind, not in a town this small, not in a place where every trail is watched and every stranger remembered. The words moved through the crowd like a slow ripple, not loud, not sudden, but persistent, and Briggs felt it, the shift beneath his boots, the way the ground of the moment was no longer as solid as it had been an hour ago, and he tried to recover it, saying that the man had been taken, that people disappear all the time out here, that it was enough that she had been found nearby, that she had been seen alone, that she was not one of them. And that last part landed harder than the rest because it was the only piece that had ever truly mattered to them. Ethan's eyes flickered once at that, not in anger, not in surprise, just in acknowledgement, as if he had heard that reasoning too many times before to be moved by it now. And he let a small breath pass through his nose before speaking again, slow and deliberate, saying that being different is not the same as being guilty, and that if they were going to take a life, they ought to be certain they understood what they were taking it for. The rope above Naeli swayed again, just a fraction, catching a thin beam of sunlight that made its fibers glow pale against the sky. And for the first time since morning, it looked less like a tool and more like a question waiting for an answer. Somewhere to the left, an older man shifted his stance and muttered that he had heard shouting the night before, that there had been voices near the creek, and all eyes turned toward him, not because his words proved anything, but because they were the first to offer something that could be examined, and he hesitated under that attention, adding that he had not seen who was there, only heard it, only assumed, and the word assumed hung there, fragile and dangerous. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of the difference between hearing and knowing, and he turned his head slightly, letting his gaze pass over the rest of the crowd, inviting them without demanding, asking if anyone else had seen, truly seen, and again the answer was silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It was no longer confident, no longer full. It was thinner now, edged with uncertainty, and that was enough. Briggs felt it slipping, the moment, the control, the simple story that had carried them this far, and he took a step forward as if to reclaim it, saying that they could not afford doubt, that doubt would paralyze them, that out here decisions had to be made quickly and firmly. But even as he said it, his voice lacked the strength it had earlier, because doubt had already arrived and it was not leaving. Ethan finally looked back at Naeli's wrist, at the leather band worn smooth by time, and he spoke not to the sheriff, not to the crowd, but to the truth that had been standing quietly between them all along, saying that some things do not lie, that some things carry stories whether people choose to listen or not. And when he reached out his hand, it was not to untie her, not yet, but to point, to draw every eye to that small, forgotten detail that none of them had thought to question. And in that moment the town realized that whatever happened next would not be decided by noise, or fear, or habit, but by something far more dangerous, the simple act of looking closer. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn not by force but by the quiet gravity of something finally being seen. And Ethan's finger hovered just inches from the leather band on Nayeli's wrist, as if that small distance held the line between ignorance and understanding. The band itself was simple, worn thin at the edges, darkened by time and weather, but there was a pattern carved into it, faint but deliberate, a mark that did not belong to chance. And Ethan's voice came low, steady, carrying just enough to reach every ear without needing to rise, saying that he had seen that mark before, not in this town, not in this moment, but somewhere that mattered more than either. Sheriff Briggs frowned, stepping closer as if proximity might give him control over something already slipping away, asking what difference a piece of leather could possibly make when a man was missing and a suspect stood right in front of them. But even he did not sound convinced, his words landing softer than he intended, as though they had to travel farther now to find belief. Ethan did not answer him directly. Instead, he reached out, and, with a care that contrasted everything the town had done so far, gently turned Nayeli's wrist just enough for the light to catch the carving, and a murmur spread through the crowd, not loud, not unified, just the sound of certainty loosening its grip one person at a time. Nayeli did not pull away, did not resist. Her gaze remained steady, but there was something new there now, not hope, not yet, but a shift, like the first breath after holding it too long. Ethan spoke again, this time not asking but remembering, saying that years ago, far from this town, a boy had worn something just like this, a boy who had wandered too close to a river after the spring thaw, a boy who would not have made it back without help. And he let the words settle before adding that the boy had come home with a story no one quite understood, a story about a stranger who did not speak his language but stayed anyway, who guided him back when the current was too strong and the path too unclear. The crowd listened now, not because they wanted to, but because they could not look away from the thread being pulled through their assumptions. And Briggs opened his mouth as if to interrupt, then closed it again, sensing that speaking too soon might expose more than it defended. Ethan's eyes returned to the bracelet, and he said that the boy had tried to describe it, the mark, the way it felt, the way it meant something he could not name, and no one had believed him fully, not because they thought he lied, but because they did not know what to do with a story that did not fit the shape of their world. He paused then, letting the memory stand on its own before lifting his gaze to meet the sheriff's, saying that the boy had grown since then, that he had learned to recognize things others overlooked, that he had learned that not every truth arrives with noise. And the meaning of his words settled slowly, like dust in still air, until it reached the edges of understanding in the crowd. Someone near the front took a step back, another followed, not in fear, but in uncertainty, as if the ground beneath them had shifted just enough to make standing still feel less certain than moving. Nayeli's eyes flickered once more, this time not just at Ethan, but at the people around her, watching them change in small ways, watching the weight of their certainty begin to bend. Briggs finally spoke again, his voice lower now, asking what exactly Ethan was implying, whether he was claiming to know this woman, whether he was willing to stake his word against the judgment of the town. And Ethan did not rush his answer. He let the question sit, let it carry its own weight before responding with the kind of calm that does not seek to win, only to reveal, saying that he was not asking them to trust him, he was asking them to question themselves, because if they were wrong, if even a piece of what they believed did not hold, then what they were about to do could not be undone. The rope above them moved again in the breeze, a quiet reminder of how close they stood to a point of no return, and for the first time since morning, no one reached for it, no one urged it forward, because doubt, once it takes root, does not ask permission to grow. Ethan's hand lowered from Nayeli's wrist, but the mark remained in every mind that had seen it, and he took a slow breath before adding one final piece, saying that the boy who had come back from that river had kept searching for the person who helped him, not out of obligation, but because some debts are not about owing, they are about remembering. And as those words settled, A realization began to form, not spoken yet, not fully understood, but present all the same. Nayeli closed her eyes for just a moment, then opened them again, and when she did, there was no fear in them, only a quiet readiness, as if whatever came next would finally belong to truth instead of assumption. And the town stood there caught between what it had believed and what it was beginning to see, held in that fragile space where a single question had done more than any weapon ever could. And if you have made it this far into the story, if you can feel the weight of that silence and the shift it carries, take a moment to like this and leave a comment, because sometimes the smallest actions are the ones that keep a story alive long enough to reach its truth. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a door opening just enough to let the truth breathe, and Sheriff Briggs felt it before anyone spoke, the way authority slips not with noise but with doubt, and he stepped forward again, closer to Ethan now, closer to Nayeli, as if distance itself had become a liability, his voice lower, measured, asking what exactly this story proved. Because a memory was not evidence, and a bracelet was not a verdict, Ethan did not argue, did not raise his tone. He simply nodded once as if agreeing with the weight of that statement. And then he turned slightly, not away from the sheriff, but toward the crowd, letting his gaze rest on faces that had begun to change in ways they did not yet understand. And he said that he was not here to prove anything for them, that truth does not need to shout when it is already standing in front of you. It only needs someone willing to see it. The words did not accuse, they invited, and that made them harder to ignore, because now the choice was no longer about believing him. It was about questioning themselves. A woman near the edge of the circle shifted her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes lingering on Nayeli longer than before, as if searching for something she had missed earlier, and a young man behind her rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward the sheriff not for direction, but for reassurance that no longer came. Nayeli stood exactly as she had before, but the space around her had changed. It was no longer a place of certainty. It was a place of waiting, and that difference carried weight. Briggs exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and for the first time his gaze moved to the bracelet, really looked at it, not as an object, but as a possibility. And when he spoke again, there was less command in it, more caution, asking Ethan if he was claiming that this woman had saved his son, if that was the story he was placing against the one the town had built. Ethan met his eyes without hesitation and said that he was not claiming anything. He was remembering. And there is a difference, because a claim asks for belief while a memory stands on its own. The distinction settled heavily, and Briggs looked away first, his attention drifting toward the horizon as if searching for something steady, something unchanged. But the morning had already moved beyond that point. A faint breeze carried through the street again, lifting dust in soft spirals that caught the light, and for a moment the entire scene felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. Then from somewhere near the back, a voice spoke, uncertain but clear enough to be heard, saying that there had been a boy found near the creek 2 days ago, not harmed, just shaken, and that he had mentioned a woman, though no one had paid much attention at the time, and the words landed like small stones in still water, sending ripples outward, touching every assumption that had been made since. Briggs turned sharply toward the speaker, asking why that had not been brought forward earlier, but the man only shrugged slightly, saying that it had not seemed important, not when everything else had already pointed in one direction, and that admission hung in the air longer than any accusation could have. Ethan did not react with surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if this was not new information, just confirmation arriving at its own pace, and he let the silence stretch once more before speaking, asking the simplest question of all, what if she stayed, not to hide, not to harm, but because she was making sure someone else made it home? No one answered, not because they could not, but because the answer was already forming in the space between them. Nayeli's gaze shifted again, not to Ethan this time, but to the man who had spoken, and there was something there, something like recognition, like a thread connecting moments that had been separated by misunderstanding, and she took a slow breath, the first visible movement she had allowed herself since morning, and though she did not speak, that breath carried more truth than anything said so far. Briggs looked back at her, really looked this time, not at what she represented, but at who she might be, and the weight of that realization settled into his posture, softening it in ways the crowd could see even if they could not name. The rope above them hung still now, no longer swaying, no longer demanding action, just present, waiting, like everything else. Ethan stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating space, as if the next move did not belong to him, as if the town itself had to decide what kind of place it wanted to be when faced with doubt. The crowd shifted again, not forward, not back, just different, and in that fragile moment, where certainty had cracked but not yet fallen apart, the truth stood quietly, patient, knowing that it did not need to rush, because once seen, it could not be unseen. No one moved to claim the moment, and that was what changed it, not a shout, not a command, but the absence of both, as if the town had suddenly forgotten how to be certain. Sheriff Briggs stood with his hand resting near his belt, not gripping it, just touching it like a habit he no longer trusted, and his eyes moved from Ethan to Nayeli and back again, searching for something final, something that would let him end this clean. But the answers were no longer clean. They had edges now, questions attached to them. The man who had spoken about the boy near the creek stepped forward half a pace, not enough to stand apart, just enough to be seen, and he cleared his throat, saying the boy had been found at first light, wet to the knees, shaking from the cold, talking about someone guiding him out of the brush, someone who stayed behind when he ran back toward town. And he hesitated there, as if the rest of the story had only just begun to make sense to him. A woman beside him nodded slowly, adding that the boy had not seemed afraid, not of the person he described, only confused why no one believed him, and the words landed soft but heavy, because they did not accuse anyone. They simply revealed what had been ignored. Ethan did not look at the speakers. He kept his gaze steady on the space between the sheriff and Nayeli, letting the truth gather without. Stand, until he could walk, until he could see the edge of the town again. And then she stopped. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because what came next did not belong to her. The crowd listened, not interrupting, not questioning, because her words did not fight them. They filled the space they had left empty. Briggs swallowed, the sound small but sharp in the quiet, and he asked why she had not come into town, why she had not told anyone, and Nayeli's eyes lifted to meet his. Again, and there was no anger there, only a tired kind of truth, and she said that she had tried before, in other places, with other people, and the answers had always been the same, that her presence spoke louder than her words, and so she had learned that sometimes helping meant leaving before being seen. The sentence settled into the crowd deeper than anything that had come before it, because it did not accuse them directly. It simply mirrored what they had already shown. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in regret, not in relief, just in acknowledgement, as if a piece of something long carried had finally found its place. And when he opened them again, he did not step forward. He did not take control. He simply waited, because this part did not belong to him. Briggs looked out at the faces around him, at men and women who had trusted him to make decisions for them, to act when they could not. And he saw something new there, not expectation, not pressure, but uncertainty, and that uncertainty asked more of him than certainty ever had. The rope above them hung still, untouched, and for the first time since it had been tied, it felt out of place, like something brought into the wrong story. Briggs reached up slowly, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just as a man correcting a mistake, and his fingers paused near the knot as if giving himself one last chance to reconsider. But there was nothing left to reconsider, only a choice that should have been made sooner. He loosened the rope carefully, letting it fall slack, and the sound it made against the wood was softer than anyone expected, a quiet release instead of a conclusion, and the crowd did not cheer, did not speak, because some endings are too honest for noise. Nayeli stood there a moment longer, her hands still bound, not moving, not reacting, as if she needed to feel the absence of judgment before she believed it. And then Briggs stepped down, his hands moving to untie the rope around her wrists with a care that mirrored what Ethan had shown earlier. And when the last knot gave way, he did not say anything, because there were no words that would not fall short. Nayeli lowered her hand slowly, the marks on her skin already fading into something that would not be seen by most. And she looked at Briggs, then at the crowd, and finally at Ethan. And in that final look there was no debt, no gratitude spoken aloud, only a quiet understanding that what had happened here would not be forgotten, not by her, not by him, and not by a town that had nearly chosen the easier path. Ethan nodded once, barely noticeable, and turned toward his horse, because his part had never been to stay, only to ask. And as he placed his foot in the stirrup and lifted himself back into the saddle, the town remained where it was, not because it did not know what to do next, but because it finally did. The town did not return to normal, not right away, because something had shifted that could not be undone by simply moving on, and people stood where they were a little longer than necessary. As if leaving too soon might mean pretending nothing had happened, Sheriff Briggs remained near the platform, the loose rope hanging beside him like a quiet reminder, and he ran a hand along the back of his neck, not out of habit this time, but because he did not quite know where to place his hands anymore. And that was new for a man who had always known exactly what to do. Naeli stepped away slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, her feet finding the ground as if it had changed beneath her, and the space that opened around her was no longer one of fear, but of distance, the kind people create when they are not sure how to stand next to something they misunderstood. Ethan Cole sat in the saddle for a moment without urging his horse forward, his eyes tracing the edges of the street, the buildings, the faces, not searching for approval, not waiting for thanks, just observing the aftermath of a question that had done what force could not. The man who had spoken about the boy near the creek stepped forward again, this time with less hesitation, and he removed his hat, holding it in his hands as he looked toward Naeli, not speaking, just acknowledging in the only way he knew how, and it was small, but it mattered, because small things were what had been missing. All along, a woman followed his lead, then another, not in unison, not as a gesture, but as something quieter, something that came from within rather than being demanded, and the town began to shift in ways that no one would have believed possible an hour ago. Briggs finally moved, stepping down from the platform completely, leaving it behind him as if it no longer belonged to him or anyone else. And he approached Naeli with a careful kind of respect, not forced, not rehearsed, just real, and he said her name, asking if that was how it was spoken, and when she nodded once, he repeated it more clearly, as if saying it right mattered more than anything else he could offer. There was no apology in his words, not because he did not feel it, but because some apologies are too large for simple language, and instead he stepped aside, creating a clear path through the town, not as permission, but as recognition. Naeli looked at him for a moment, then at the path, and then at Ethan, and there was a quiet exchange in that glance, something that did not need words, because it had already been spoken in action. She walked forward, her steps even, her posture unchanged, but the way the town watched her was no longer the same. It was not suspicion, not fear, but something closer to awareness, the kind that arrives late but stays. Ethan finally shifted in his saddle, giving his horse a light nudge, and the animal responded with a slow turn, hooves pressing into the dirt with a steady rhythm that matched the pace of the moment. And as he began to ride away, no one stopped him, no one called out, because they understood, in a way they had not before, that his role had never been to stay, only to see and to ask. The breeze moved again, carrying with it the faint sounds of the town beginning to breathe differently, quieter, more thoughtful, and the platform stood empty now, the rope hanging loose, no longer a symbol of certainty, but of something avoided, something learned. Briggs watched Ethan ride toward the edge of town, his figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of land beyond, and he felt the weight of what had almost happened settle into him, not as guilt alone, but as a lesson that would not leave easily. And he turned back to the people who remained, knowing that whatever came next would require more than habit, it would require attention. Naeli reached the far side of the street and paused for a brief moment, not to look back at the crowd, but to take in the horizon ahead, the open land that did not ask questions in the same way. And then she continued on, her figure moving steadily away, not hurried, not lingering, just continuing, as she always had. The town remained quiet for a while longer, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were learning, perhaps for the first time, that not every moment needs to be filled with words, that sometimes silence is where understanding begins. And if you have stayed with this story to this point, if you have felt the weight of what nearly was and what quietly changed, then thank you for being here. Because stories like this are not carried by noise, they are carried by those willing to listen all the way through. The dust settled slower that afternoon, as if the town itself had forgotten how to move at its old pace. And long after Naeli disappeared beyond the far edge of the road, people remained where they were, not speaking, not leaving, just standing with the weight of something unfinished resting quietly in their chests. Sheriff Briggs stayed near the empty platform, his eyes drifting back to the rope more than once. Not because it held meaning anymore, but because it reminded him how close meaning could be mistaken for certainty. And he reached up at last, pulling it down completely, coiling it in his hands with care that felt almost like respect, as if the object itself deserved better than what it had nearly been used for. A boy's voice broke the silence from somewhere behind the crowd, small, uncertain, asking if it was over now, and his mother did not answer right away, her hand resting on his shoulder as she watched the place where Naeli had stood, as if the answer required more than a simple word. Ethan Cole had nearly reached the edge of town when he slowed his horse again. Not because he was called back, not because he had forgotten something, but because there are moments that ask you to look once more before you leave them behind. And he turned slightly in the saddle, just enough to see the street, the people, the platform now empty under the afternoon light, and he nodded to himself in a way no one else would notice, as if confirming something that had never needed to be said aloud. Back in the center of town, the man who had spoken earlier about the boy near the creek found himself unable to leave, his boots rooted in the same spot, his thoughts replaying what he had heard, what he had ignored, and what he had almost allowed to happen. And he looked around at the others, seeing the same reflection in their faces, not guilt alone, but a quiet kind of realization that they had followed something easier instead of something true. One by one, they began to move, not with urgency, not with direction, just small steps that broke the stillness. A woman turning back toward her shop, a pair of men picking up their hats from where they had set them down, a child pulling gently at his father's sleeve, asking a question that would not be answered the same way as it might have been that morning. Sheriff Briggs stepped off the last board of the platform and onto the dirt, the coil of rope still in his hands, and he carried it to the side of the building, setting it down carefully, not hiding it, not discarding it, just placing it where it would remain as a reminder rather than a tool. And when he turned back toward the street, his posture had changed in a way that did not need explanation, less rigid, more aware, as if the space around him had grown wider. A few people approached him, not to question, not to argue, but to stand near, to be close to the moment that had shifted them, and no one spoke at first, because words felt too heavy, too final, and instead they shared a silence that was different from the one before, not empty, but full of something forming. Ethan finally urged his horse forward again, leaving the town behind for good. The sound of hooves fading into the open land where no crowd waited and no judgment lingered, and as he rode, the memory of the bracelet remained with him, not as proof, not as victory, but as something quieter, something that reminded him that the smallest details often carry the heaviest truths. Far ahead, where the road bent toward the hills, a faint figure moved along the horizon, steady and unhurried. And though the distance made it impossible to be certain, Ethan did not need to see clearly to understand who it was, and he did not call out, did not change his path. Because some meetings are not meant to repeat, they are meant to be remembered. Back in the town, the platform stood alone now, its purpose undone, its presence softened by the light, and a boy wandered closer to it, looking up at the empty beam above, then down at the ground where the dust still held the faint marks of boots and hesitation, and he frowned slightly, as if trying to understand something larger than the scene itself. His mother joined him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, and when he asked again if it was over, she finally answered, her voice quiet but certain, saying that some things do not end. They change, and that what mattered was what they chose next. The boy looked at her, then back at the platform, and nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but feeling that it was enough for now. The town began to return to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It carried a pause within it, a space where questions could exist, where answers might take longer, and that space, though small, was enough to alter everything that came after. And somewhere beyond the edge of sight, Beyond the last fence and the last shadow of the town, two paths continued in different directions, one leading back to a life that would remember this day in silence, and the other forward into a land that did not ask who you were before it let you pass, only how you chose to walk through it. The sun had begun its slow descent when the town finally found its voice again, not loud, not certain, but present in small, careful ways, like people learning to speak after holding silence too long. And the streets carried a different kind of movement now, one that paused before acting, one that looked twice instead of once. Sheriff Briggs remained near the center longer than most, not because he had nowhere to go, but because leaving felt too easy, and easy had brought them all too close to something they could not take back. So he stayed, watching the patterns of the town reassemble themselves piece by piece, noticing things he had not noticed before, the way a man hesitated before making a claim, the way a woman looked at another before agreeing, the way even the wind seemed to carry questions now instead of answers. Inside one of the small storefronts, the woman who had stood near the edge of the crowd earlier moved slowly behind her counter, her hands resting on the worn wood. As she stared out the window, replaying the moment in her mind, the rope, the silence, the question, and she shook her head gently, not in disbelief, but in recognition of how close they had come to being wrong together. Outside, the boy who had asked if it was over wandered toward the far end of the street, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust as he walked, and he stopped where the road opened wide, looking out toward the horizon where two figures had passed earlier, one riding, one walking, both leaving without looking back, and the boy stood there for a long moment, as if trying to understand why someone would help and then go, why someone would be saved and then leave. And though he could not find the words for it, he felt that it mattered. Sheriff Briggs eventually moved as well, not with purpose, but with intention, and he walked toward the small office that had always been his place of authority, pushing open the door and stepping inside, the familiar space greeting him in a way that felt unfamiliar now, and he paused. Just inside, his eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time, the desk, the chair, the papers stacked neatly in places where decisions had been made quickly, too quickly, and he walked over, placing his hands on the surface, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palms, grounding himself in something real before he reached for a piece of paper and began to write. Not a report, not a justification, but a record, something that would remain when memory tried to soften what had happened. He wrote slowly, carefully, each word chosen with more thought than he had given many decisions before, and when he finished, he did not fold it away. He left it on the desk where it could be seen, not hidden, because this was not something to be put aside. It was something to be remembered. Back on the street, the man who had first spoken about the boy near the creek found himself walking toward the same direction Naeli had gone, not to follow, not to catch up, but to see the place where the story had begun. And as he reached the edge of town, the ground changed slightly beneath his feet, softer, less traveled, and he looked down, noticing the faint impressions left behind, a pattern of steps that told their own quiet story, one steady, one lighter, both moving away from the water and towards safety. And he stood there for a moment, taking it in, understanding now what he had not before. Ethan Cole rode on without turning again, the town behind him shrinking into something smaller, something contained, and the open land ahead stretching wide and indifferent, the kind of place that did not hold on to mistakes or victories, only movement. And he let the rhythm of his horse carry him forward, the memory of the day settling into him not as something to revisit, but as something that would guide the next time a question needed to be asked. Far ahead, the faint outline of a figure remained just visible against the fading light, moving with the same steady pace. Not passes between two lives for only a moment. The sky shifted slowly toward evening, the colors deepening, shadows stretching longer across the land, and the town behind them settled into a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by certainty, but by awareness. And that awareness lingered in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses before decisions, in the way people looked at one another with a little more care. And as the last light touched the edge of the platform, now standing empty, the wood, catching a soft glow before fading into shadow, it held no power anymore, no authority, only the memory of what had almost been, and the quiet proof that sometimes, All it takes to change everything is a single question, asked at the right moment, by someone willing to stand still long enough to hear the answer. Morning came softer the next day, as if the land itself had chosen not to rush the light back into that town. And when the first doors opened and the first boots touched the street, there was a pause in each step, a quiet hesitation that had not been there before. Sheriff Briggs stood outside his office earlier than usual, the paper he had written resting behind him on the desk, untouched, unhidden, and he watched as people moved past him, some offering a nod, some avoiding his gaze, not out of. The creek returned with dust on his boots and something steadier in his step, and when someone asked him what he had found, he did not offer a story, only a quiet answer, saying that the ground remembers even when people forget, and that was enough. The platform still stood, but it no longer drew attention. It existed now as part of the town's shape, not its purpose, and a few boards had been loosened by the wind overnight, creaking softly as if even the wood had decided it did not wish to hold. Wait like that again. Ethan Cole was miles away by then, the town reduced to a faint line behind him, and he rode without hurry, the open land stretching wide on either side, the air carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, and he did not replay the moment, did not turn it over in his mind, because he knew that what mattered had already settled where it needed to be, not in memory alone, but in the quiet space where future choices are made. Ahead of him, the trail bent toward a shallow valley, and he noticed fresh tracks along the edge, lighter than a horse, steady, deliberate, and he slowed for a moment, not to follow, not to close the distance, but to recognize them, to see that they continued, that they did not falter, and then he rode on, letting the path remain separate, as it was meant to be. Back in the town, Sheriff Briggs stepped into the center of the street once more, not to command, not to gather attention, but simply to stand where he had stood the day before, and he looked around, seeing the same buildings, the same faces, but through a different understanding, and he realized that authority was not in the volume of a voice or the speed of a decision, but in the willingness to pause when something did not feel right. A few people joined him there, not called, not summoned, just present, and they stood together in a quiet kind of agreement that did not need words, because what they had nearly done had already spoken loudly enough. The boy looked at the empty platform again, then at his mother, and this time when he asked if it was truly over, she knelt slightly so she could meet his eyes, and she told him that what was over was not the moment, but the way they would choose to see the next one. And the boy nodded, not fully understanding, but carrying the feeling of it with him. The wind moved gently through the street, lifting dust in soft patterns that caught the light, and for a brief second, it felt as though the town was breathing in a different rhythm, one that allowed space for questions, for doubt, for the kind of thinking that does not come easily but stays once it arrives. And somewhere far beyond the edge of that place, two lives continued on separate paths, one shaped by a question asked at the right time, the other by a truth finally seen, and neither needed to look back, because the mark they left behind was not in the ground or the buildings, but in the quiet shift of a town that had learned, even if only once, that justice does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives in silence, waiting for someone to notice it is already there. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. They unfolded the same way all days did in a place like that, with sun over the rooftops and dust rising under boots. But something beneath those familiar rhythms had shifted, quiet but steady, like a current running under still water, and people felt it in the way they paused before speaking, in the way they looked a little longer at the faces around them. Sheriff Briggs kept the paper on his desk where anyone could see it, not framed, not protected, just there, a plain record written in his own hand, and though few stepped inside to read it fully, many glanced at it as they passed, and that was enough, because the act of knowing it existed carried weight. The boy who had been found by the creek returned to that same place with his mother one afternoon, the sun warm on their backs, the sound of water moving gently over stones, and he pointed to the bank where he had slipped, explaining again in his own words what had happened, but this time his mother listened differently, not correcting, not dismissing, just hearing, and when he finished she nodded slowly, as if accepting not just his story, but the space it needed to be believed. Back in town, the platform had been taken down board by board, not in a rush, not as a spectacle, but quietly, as if the town understood that removing it was not about erasing what had happened, but about choosing not to build it again. And the wood was stacked neatly behind the sheriff's office, where it would be used for something else, something that did not carry the same weight. Ethan Cole continued his ride across the open land, the horizon wide and unbroken, and though he did not look back, there were moments when the memory of that town returned, not as a burden, but as a marker, a place where a single question had shifted more than one life. And he carried that knowledge with him the way a man carries a compass, not always looking at it, but trusting it when the path becomes uncertain. Far ahead, the land rose slightly, forming a ridge that caught the evening light, and on that ridge, a figure paused for a moment, standing still against the sky, and though distance made details impossible, there was no mistaking the steadiness of that posture, the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to hurry, and Ethan allowed himself a brief glance before continuing on. Because some acknowledgments do not require words, they exist in the simple act of seeing and being seen. In the town, people began to speak differently, not louder, not more often, but with a care that had not been there before. And when disagreements arose, as they always do, there was a pause now, a moment where someone might ask a question instead of making a claim. And that small change altered the shape of those conversations in ways no one could have predicted. Sheriff Briggs found himself listening more than speaking, his role shifting not because it was taken from him, but because he chose to carry it differently. And in that choice, others found space to do the same. The woman at the shop kept placing a cup of water outside each morning. Sometimes it was taken, sometimes it was not. But she never stopped, because the act itself had become part of who she was now. A quiet reminder that small gestures can hold meaning far beyond their size. The man who had walked to the creek returned. There often, not searching for anything new, but grounding himself in what he had learned, tracing the faint paths along the bank, noticing how quickly they faded, and understanding that memory, like those marks, requires attention to remain clear. As the weeks passed, the town did not forget, not entirely, because forgetting would mean losing the lesson, and instead it carried the memory in subtle ways. In the way a name was asked before a judgment was made, in the way a stranger was met with a question instead of an assumption, and out beyond the reach of that place, the land continued as it always had, wide and indifferent, holding no record of what had changed, and yet somehow, in the quiet between footsteps and the space between words, the echo of that single moment remained, not as a story told loudly, but as a truth understood quietly, that sometimes the difference between right and wrong is not in what is seen first, but in what is asked next. By the time another week passed, the change in the town was no longer something people noticed directly. It had become part of how things worked, the way a new habit settles and so quietly that no one remembers when it began, and yet every action carried a trace of it. Every conversation held a fraction more weight than before. Sheriff Briggs no longer stood at the center out of duty alone. He moved through the town like a man aware that each step mattered, that each decision echoed further than the moment it was made, and sometimes he would stop mid-stride, not because he was uncertain, but because he was considering, and that pause, brief as it was, became something others began to mirror. The paper on his desk remained where it had been placed, its edges beginning to curl slightly with time, and though it was never announced, never read aloud, it found its way into the awareness of nearly everyone, not as a document, but as a presence, a quiet reminder that truth does not always arrive in time, and when it does, it asks to be remembered. The boy by the creek returned again, this time alone, his steps more confident, his eyes scanning the bank not for fear, but for understanding, and he stood there looking at the water, the same water that had once seemed overwhelming, now moving gently as if it had always known he would come back, and he knelt, placing his hand just above the surface, feeling the current without stepping in, as if learning that some forces do not need to be fought, only respected. In the town, the woman with the water cup added a second one beside it, not because it was needed, but because she had come to understand that kindness does not measure itself by necessity, it offers what it can without waiting to be asked, and those who passed by noticed, some pausing, some continuing, but all aware that something small had grown into something steady. The man who had once spoken hesitantly now found his voice more often, not louder, not forceful, but clearer, and when discussions arose, he would ask questions instead of offering conclusions, and others began to follow, not out of agreement, but because it felt right, because it opened space instead of closing it. Far from the town, Ethan Cole reached a ridge where the land dipped into a wide valley, and he stopped there for a moment, letting his horse rest, the wind moving across the grass in long, quiet waves, and he looked out over the distance, not searching for anything, just taking in the openness, the way the land held no judgment, no memory of what had happened behind him, and yet he carried it all the same, not as a burden, but as a guide, something that would shape the next moment he chose to stop instead of pass by. He thought briefly of the bracelet, the mark worn into its surface, the way something so small had carried a truth no one else had seen, and he understood that it was never about the object itself. It was about the willingness to notice it, to let it matter, and that understanding stayed with him as he continued on, his path leading him further into a land that asked nothing but presence. Back in the town, Sheriff Briggs stood once more at the place where the platform had been, the ground now bare, the boards long removed, and he looked down at the dirt, seeing only faint impressions where once there had been certainty, and he realized that what remained was not the mark of what almost happened, but the space where something else could take root, something better, something chosen. A few townspeople joined him there, not out of habit, but because they had begun to gather in that place, not to judge, but to remember, and they stood in a quiet circle, no longer a crowd, just individuals sharing the same understanding, and no one spoke, because the silence had become something different now. It was no longer empty. It was full of awareness, of reflection, of a shared acknowledgement that they had changed, even if only in small ways. The wind passed through again, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and for a moment, it felt as though the land itself had taken a breath with them, holding it just long enough to let the lesson settle deeper. And somewhere far beyond their sight, beyond the hills and the open sky, a man rode on and a woman walked on, each carrying their own quiet truths, their paths never meant to cross again, and yet connected by a single moment that had asked a simple question, and in asking it, had changed more than anyone there would ever fully understand. Time did not erase what had happened, it settled it, pressed it gently into the fabric of the town until it became something carried rather than something spoken. And as the days turned into weeks, the change revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the small choices that defined everyday life. Sheriff Briggs found himself walking slower than before, not from age, not from fatigue, but from intention. And when people approached him with disputes, with concerns, with the kind of matters that once demanded quick decisions, he listened longer, his silence no longer a sign of uncertainty, but of care, and those who stood before him felt it, the difference between being judged and being heard. The boy by the creek had begun to bring small stones with him each time he visited, placing them along the bank in a line that followed the path he had once taken, not perfectly straight, not measured, but steady. And when his mother asked him why, he said it helped him remember where he had been and where he had turned back, and she nodded, understanding that some paths need markers, even if only for the one who walked them. In the center of town, where the platform had once stood, grass began to push through the dirt in thin green strands, fragile but persistent, and no one stepped on it, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, as if the ground itself deserved time to become something else, something untouched by what had nearly happened there. The woman at the shop now greeted each passerby by name when she could, and when she did not know a name, she asked for it, not out of politeness, but because she had learned that knowing someone begins with that simple act, and those who heard their names spoken paused, just for a moment, as if recognizing something they had not realized they missed. The man who had once hesitated to speak became someone others turned to, not because he had answers, but because he asked the kind of questions that opened space instead of closing it. And in those spaces, the town found itself changing again and again, each time a little more aware, a little more careful, far beyond the reach of that place. Ethan Cole rode through a stretch of land where the sky seemed wider than usual, where the horizon did not end but faded, and he slowed his horse near a shallow stream, letting it drink, the sound of water soft against the quiet, and he dismounted, kneeling beside it, his fingers brushing the surface as if grounding himself in something simple and true. And for a moment, he thought of the creek, of the boy, of the woman who had stayed when she could have left, and he understood that the question he had asked was not the beginning of the truth. It was the opening that allowed it to be seen. He stood again, wiping his hands on his coat, and looked out across the land, not searching, not expecting, just present. And then he mounted his horse once more, continuing forward with the same steady pace that had carried him there. Somewhere along another path, unseen and unspoken, Nayeli walked. With that same steadiness, her steps carrying her further from the town, further from the moment that had almost defined her, and yet she did not leave it behind entirely, because the truth of what had happened did not belong to that place alone. It belonged to her as well, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even in silence, something can be seen if someone is willing to look. Back in the town, Sheriff Briggs returned to the place where the grass had begun to grow, and he stood there for a long moment, his eyes on the ground, his thoughts not on what had almost been done, but on what had been prevented. And he realized that justice is not always about correcting a wrong. Sometimes it is about stopping one before it happens, and that understanding settled into him in a way that would not leave. The wind moved gently through the street, carrying the faint sound of conversation, of life continuing, and in that sound there was something new, something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself. And though no one spoke of it directly, though no marker was placed, no sign raised, the town held on to that moment in the only way that mattered, by changing, by choosing, again and again, to ask before assuming, to see before deciding. And in that choice, they found something they had not known they were missing, a kind of justice that does not arrive with force, but with understanding, and once it arrives, it does not leave. The season turned slowly, the kind of change that does not announce itself but reveals itself in the way the light shifts across the land, in the way mornings arrive a little cooler and evenings stretch a little longer, and the town moved with it, not as it once had, but with a quiet awareness that had settled into its bones. Sheriff Briggs stood outside his office one evening as the sun dipped low, the sky painted in soft gold and fading blue, and he watched as people crossed the street, greeting one another by name, pausing when they spoke, listening in ways that had not come naturally before, and he realized that what had changed was not just a single moment, but the way moments were handled thereafter. The grass that had begun to grow where the platform once stood had thickened, small but steady, and no one disturbed it, not because it was protected, but because it was understood, a silent marker of something that did not need to be spoken aloud. The boy by the creek had placed his last stone at the edge of the path, completing a line that only he fully understood, and when he stepped back to look at it, there was a quiet satisfaction in his expression, not pride, not relief, just a sense that he had done what he needed to do. And he turned away, leaving the stones where they lay, knowing they would not last forever, but that they had served their purpose. The woman at the shop still placed water outside each morning, though now she sometimes added a piece of bread beside it, not for anyone specific, not for any reason she could explain, only because it felt right, and that was reason enough. The man who had once hesitated now stood with others at the center of town, not to gather, not to judge, but to share the quiet presence of people who had learned something together, something that did not require agreement, only awareness. Far beyond the reach of that place, Ethan Cole rode along a ridge where the wind moved steadily through the tall grass, and he slowed his horse as the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the land, and he looked out over the distance, not searching, not expecting, just present in the moment. And there was a calm in that presence, a quiet understanding that some things are meant to be carried forward without being spoken again. Somewhere along another path, unseen but not forgotten, Nayeli walked beneath the same fading light, her steps as steady as they had always been, her path her own, and though the town was now far behind her, the moment that had passed there remained, not as something that defined her, but as something that had revealed itself, and she carried that truth with the same quiet strength she had carried everything else. Back in the town, Sheriff Briggs stepped into the center of the street once more, not out of duty, but out of reflection, and he stood where the platform had once been, the grass soft beneath his boots, and he looked around at the people, the buildings, the space that had changed without needing to be rebuilt. And he understood that justice is not something that arrives once and remains. It is something that must be chosen. Again and again, in small ways, in quiet moments, in the decision to pause, to ask, to see. The wind passed through, gentle and steady, carrying with it the sound of the town as it lived on, not louder, not greater, but different. And in that difference there was something lasting, something that would remain even as time moved forward. And though no one marked the day, though no story was written or told beyond what was needed, the truth of what had happened stayed, not in the ground, not in the buildings, but in the way people looked at one another, in the way they chose to act when faced with uncertainty. And in that quiet, lasting change, the town found something it had not known it was missing, a kind of justice that does not demand attention, does not seek recognition, but exists in the simple act of choosing to understand before deciding. And once found, it does not leave. It remains steady and silent, like the land itself. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.